So welcome everybody. This is the 19th GRC Supper Club, albeit the 4th virtual one. And when we did the trilogy, the COVID trilogy last, I think it was this time last year, I think none of us expected to go into a 4th virtual event. And I'm hoping this will be the last one before we actually go into face-to-face meetings again and live dinners. So we'll keep our fingers crossed there. And as I've just mentioned, for those that were on just a second ago, the topic of tonight's event is as above, SOX-lite below. RegPain is the remedy, combined assurance and self-demonstration. So, you know, it is over-engineered, but bear with me, because the esteemed speakers we have for you tonight have been working hard prior to the event, aligning topics and to make the event flow all the way to the panel discussion at the end. Tonight is really about understanding if a combination of SOX-lite or SOX UK with combined assurance and self-demonstration will really help you reduce that regulatory pain or that continual regulatory change that you're seeing. We're going to start with Suzanne. So please welcome to the stage, Suzanne Kilcagno, if I pronounced that right, Suzanne. And
very close, yes.
Was that right?
Very close.
She is the Global Head of Regulatory Response and Oversight at HSBC. And we spoke earlier in the week and last week as a group, and some of the areas that Suzanne's going to touch on is around the regulations, G20 and the maturing of the rules, and also assessing effectiveness of processes, be it audit, board and regulatory scrutiny. So I'm going to hand over now and welcome Suzanne.
Thank you, Lee. Can everybody hear me okay? I was telling Lee earlier, my VPN, I think it's classic COVID, my VPN has been a bit finicky today, so I'll just raise your hand if I start to break up a bit. But thanks so much, Lee, for the invite, and to Capco as well. As I said, I'll start this, as all good panel talks do, with the note that my comments are my own and not HSBC's. But I think they sort of represent the direction of travel that we're on. So a little bit of background about me. I joined HSBC in 2019 in June into what was my first role in operations. So I am the head of reg response and oversight for the broader operations team, which I think was really in recognition of the fact that operational risk and regulatory risk are related notes. And whereas previously there was quite a bit of really excellent coverage around operational risk, there was less focus on helping the teams get ahead of regulatory risk and really assess the effectiveness of their processes and how it aligned to the regulators' expectations. So prior to that, I started my career a million years ago as a commodities trader. And then I moved into legal and compliance after I did my qualifications to become a lawyer in the States. So this role, I think, is in an area that's sort of been historically underserved from a compliance and reg perspective, which is really focused on post-trade, so operations, technology, and finance. And my current role, we refer to it as a line 1A role under the kind of 3 lines of defense model, in that it's really my job to work from within the team to challenge the adequacy and effectiveness of our processes and controls, with really the related goals of identifying and managing issues as they come up, figuring out what internal and external escalations are necessary, and then looking to facilitate internal and external exams related to those processes. So it's kind of a front to back view, in that I also advise the change teams on their plans to operationalize new and amended regs, and then also work with them to assess sort of the effectiveness of those implementations. So what I'll cover today will address some of the issues on Lee's agenda, but happy to take questions on anything else that folks would like to talk about.
Oh, and Suzanne, sorry to butt in. I forgot to mention that we have got I'll be popping in to keep us on time, but also your point about the Q&A. There is a Q&A panel, which I forgot to mention. Hopefully you've got access to that as attendees. Fire any questions over, and we'll ask a couple to Suzanne at the end before we go into Sonia's conversation. Back to you, Suzanne, sorry.
No worries, thanks, Lee. So in the last few years, I think the one remarkable trend, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, is what we've witnessed around the increasing sophistication of the regulators that we interact with. And as a consequence, they're really ever increasing expectations of maturity in our ability to comply with those regulations and to respond to issues as they come up. So I'll focus most of this on the reg reporting space because that's what I've been spending time on in the last 6 to 8 months, but it's applicable really across all the operations rule sets. So the completeness of reporting is assumed. They assume that we've got it right at this point, given that many of these regulations have been in place for upwards of 10 years. The more recent ones in Europe and the UK in the last 4 to 5 years. So there's a real expectation that the models are mature and that firms have the ability to identify, escalate, and remediate issues as they come up. And I think we're seeing some of that embodied now in the new rules that are coming out, or the refits and rewrites, which really up again that level of expectation in terms of creating really quite tight timelines within which firms are expected to be able to resolve issues. So from our interactions, the regulators have really all made clear that they're also now using reporting submissions beyond just validating that we're complying with the rules that require us to report, but also to facilitate their market surveillance, their prudential supervision, and also to look at market trends, not just relating to the individual transactions, but you've seen some enforcement actions recently, I guess one specifically this week, where regulatory reporting submissions were actually used to identify a pattern that led to some concerns about money laundering and some sanctions violations. So it's been really interesting to me to see how they've become much more sophisticated at using this information in a way that enables their mission, which, as much as it obviously keeps us on our toes, is gratifying because it's much more than just sort of sending the information into the void. We know it's being used meaningfully at the other end. And in that vein, the focus has really shifted to improving the quality and the utility of the data being reported. So we've been gratified to see some of the refit exercises really look at whether all of the information that's being submitted is really necessary, and whether some of those obligations can actually be pared back or really demised. And we're seeing a lot of increasing focus, not just on the quality of compliance with that obligation, but also with how we determine whether or not we're actually doing it right. So I know the panel will speak to that later, but I'll talk a little bit now about how we look at that. So in terms of frameworks, really in order to demonstrate the effectiveness of processes and oversight, we've been working to establish a framework which defines minimum standards for the individual controls that we run. And those minimum standards typically speak to the scope of the control, the frequency within which it's run, and then sort of what do we do with the output in terms of escalations and resolution. And we worked very hard to get the front office risk owners and the second line risk stewards on board with that model, because it identifies not just what we do, but also what we don't do, so that when we do come to be examined or audited, it's clear what activities we've been undertaking. And then the way we've sort of thought about it is somebody can tell us we've drawn that line in the wrong place and we should be doing more, but we at least can have that conversation consciously and not based on kind of a sort of side of desk view. So ideally, the framework should create a set of common standards and across those controls that can be measured. So what we've asked the BAU teams to do, the guys who are actually operating these controls, is to maintain affirmative evidence that can be validated by teams like mine and also our colleagues in line 2 and 3, rather than at the time of an exam or at the time of an audit, having to scramble to compile all that. So it's often styled under continuous improvement, but really it's continuous monitoring. And it's actually, at first, I think it felt very onerous to them, but now that they've been doing it for quite a while, it feels that it's embedded, and also they kind of see the value as we've had exams come through where all they had to do was like hit a button and send me everything that they've been maintaining, rather than trying to build evidence at the time of the exam. So even though the promise of harmonization across the G20 regs really hasn't materialized, and I know there's been lots written on that, and there's lots of good articles on LinkedIn that seek to kind of solve that problem, we really have to deal with the regulations as they stand now. So the use of that common assessment framework across all the regimes lets us calibrate against the relative risk posed by each regulation, and provide a consistent assessment of whether our operational control environment really mitigates that risk. So that's kind of our calculation. What's the risk level? Is our operational control environment adequate to mitigate it? And if not, what's the residual risk, and how do we address that? So that's enabled us to create a set of central data quality controls where the regulations have the same definitions and taxonomy for those attributes, and then to use them in other parts of the organization. So again, kind of creating that common set of expectations. And then obviously off the side, we've had to maintain bespoke controls where the regulators haven't harmonized, or where we're starting to see some increasing divergence as well post-Brexit. So the challenge, of course, with any framework is that it can take quite a long time to develop, socialize, and launch. So at the same time, we've really had to figure out how to stay, I hate the word agile because it's used far too often now, but we've had to figure out how to stay nimble in order to absorb and respond to regulator guidance, QA, things like the market watch issuances, and to trigger events like enforcement actions in a way that lets us continue to assess and perform targeted effectiveness reviews based on the issues raised in whether it's QA or enforcement actions, and then embed those recommendations into the framework as we move through. So in terms of cost, always the key question. I think the age-old question for us has been build versus buy. There are really increasingly excellent, sophisticated tools in the market that provide assurance controls, and also some pre-submission checks. The challenge there is that some of them can be obviously quite difficult to integrate. And as the refits and rewrites are happening in the market, that I think will be the really good opportunity for the industry to step back and say, okay, which of these tools works best within my framework and can be integrated, and as contrasted with what we would build internally. So at the same time, we're also looking at operating models and our location strategy to ensure that we've got both the right balance of expertise, but also the right level of supervision of our offshore teams and teams in some of our smaller trading locations, to really primarily to facilitate them using the same set of standards and the same framework, which we found probably more difficult than I would have expected, given that in some of the individual regulations are quite specific. They can be very tailored to their own location. I see your sign, Lee. Thank you.
No problem.
So really key for our front office sponsors is the question of whether we're getting good value for the investment we're making in all these efforts, because at the end of the day, we're not going to play, we're going to work. And I always tell them compliance itself is its own reward, but they are increasingly asking for us to be able to demonstrate that we're investing in the right areas of the program to produce the most value in the form of risk mitigation. So that has also become part of our assurance process to be able to demonstrate progress both in reducing our remediation backlog and I of course always having fewer incidents and fewer inquiries. So in terms of the pace of change, which Lee asked me to cover, we get a lot of requests for us to be able to kind of absorb unplanned change, whether that comes in the form of a business mandate changing or changes to the regulation that we weren't anticipating. That to me is the biggest operational challenge that we face, because the rules are quite complex, and it can be difficult to just absorb a whole new rule set into our process. So that's the one challenge we've set ourselves this year, is to kind of set aside some capacity to be able to do that in a way to just address everything happening in the market. So in terms of assessing effectiveness, I'll cover this super quick and then hand over to Sonia. Our approach to the second and third line has become much more collaborative because of the complexity of the rules. It's really not realistic to parachute an operational risk team or an audit team or a compliance assurance team into a function within operations and expect them to understand the ins and outs just of the mechanics of how things work, but also of the really complex rules. So we're conscious that they have to maintain independence and not be seen as embedded in our space, but we found that regular dialogue has really been helpful in the quality of the output of their reviews and really providing good information for us to absorb into our process. So we've observed that rather than a complete reliance on formal annual planning of reviews, those teams are also working to be a bit more nimble and responsive to issues as they come up, which we found to be really positive. So I know Sonia's going to talk more about the alignment of assurance between the first and second line and some tools to use to do that. So I might just close there and hand over.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you, Suzanne. What I wanted to touch base in with is a couple of questions that have come in. I think you may have touched on the first one already, but it was really about how companies are managing the pace of change. And you may have just touched on that actually, but is there anything you can add a bit more around that in your experience over the last year or two on that?
Yeah, I think planning has become much more aggressive in that we, beyond just planning a budget, we've also had to plan literally month by month, you know, and I'm not a Gantt chart expert by any stretch, but we've become very specific, whereas you used to plan things quarter by quarter. We're now having to be very specific in terms of when rules will be clarified, when the requirements will be obvious, and when we can start to build. And also that pace of change is helping us manage testing. So if we can anticipate it, we can be sort of dev complete sooner and give ourselves more time to test, and then hopefully have fewer issues once we go live. But it's definitely a challenge. We had hoped that things would quiet down post Brexit, but it's been quite the opposite.
No, I can imagine. And also with, again, I think you touched on this question as well that's come in from Dev from 2MC, was really around about the operating model. If you've installed an operating model to, you know, to remediate some of the regulations coming in, obviously with the pace of change that's going on, that could be obsolete within a month. And, you know, how are companies managing that at the minute, or how are you looking to do that going forward? Again, I think you did touch on it a little bit. But
a little bit, yeah. So for us, it's been about figuring out how to balance our location strategy in terms of having some quite senior people with, you know, years and years of experience in the space, in the trading hubs, and then really making more active use of the teams that we have in our service centers, who are excellent and sort of super keen to be not just in a processing role, but in a role where they have sort of buy into the process and are helping to drive the operating model. So we found that really productive this year. The key for us really has been, I think, given the cost environment and obviously the impact of COVID, we've had real resource challenges. So we've had to really try to plan every additional capacity into every pod so that they can absorb change as it comes through, and we're not kind of scheduled to the nth degree, and then forced into kind of panic stations if something comes in that can't readily be addressed. So I wouldn't say we've got it perfect, but I think we're doing better than we were a year ago. So that feels good.
That was great. Thank you very much. But I'd like to thanks Suzanne for her talk. It was very insightful. She's got bandwidth issues, so she is a real person. She's not an AI.
I promise. Yeah.
Excuse me. So she didn't have the ability to put the camera on. So thank you very much, Suzanne. Sonia is the Emir Chief Controls Officer at BNY Mellon, and she's also a member of Women in Risk and Control that is run by Rupal, who works at ASIN with myself. But Sonia's going to take us through the command assurance across first and second line. We've then got a couple of polls, and then we'll be talking about her experience in implementing SOX projects and also driving, you know, more in-depth MI. So at that point, please welcome to the stage, Sonia Jackman.
Thanks, Lee, and cheers. This is water, unfortunately. I didn't trust myself to have a GNT this time before speaking, but next time maybe. So I hope I can match up to Suzanne. I thought that was excellent and really useful to understand how things can be done, and also really encouraging to see from you know, a global lead located in London. So that was really good. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a very proud founder, member of Women in Risk and Control, and I'm happy to support this initiative because of that. I think we can have a much more louder voice, I think, in the risk and control community, and I like to sponsor that. So I grew up in financial control environment. I qualified as a chartered accountant, and I worked with a predecessor firm of Ernst EY. So that really dates me. Like Suzanne, I focus more on the financial risk aspects, treasury type controls, at the time. And it was really when I moved to the UK in '99 and became a partner in the EY practice in London, where I started to broaden the net from control and financial control to a broader risk and control discussion outside of just the financial control environment. So I also migrated across the three lines of defense quite a bit. So I spent a lot of time in the consulting side and consulting across implementation of three lines defense models, implementation of risk and control kind of frameworks, methodologies, taxonomies, measurements, and embedment. I also spent time in a very large UK bank, a UK-based global bank, where I had a fairly large team focusing on operational risk, assurance. At the time, I brought Sarbanes-Oxley into the fold, pretty much because I could see the synergies between the entity level controls and the work we were doing on the control taxonomy at the time in operational risk. And that was really, it was a useful connection to make at that stage. And I think tonight is all about talking about those connections between the different topics and how do you make the most of it. So I think we have got some poll questions, Lee. I don't know if you can bring the first one up, perhaps.
Yes, I can do my best to activate the first one.
And it's about what I expected, because I think, people experience the pain where they are, right? There's of course a lot of pain in the compliance area. There's of course a lot of pain in the first line front office and the supporting functions that has got to make this happen and embed and evidence. And of course, a lot of pain in the change functions as well, because this continuous pressure. But everyone plays their part. And as I said earlier, I think today is really about those connections between the two. So I wanted to touch a little bit around the importance of first line and second line working together. Because like Suzanne, we've got a regulatory change model, we call it, not a framework, because that's a preference, apparently, organizational-wide. And it really sets out the different stages of regulatory change. It sets out roles and responsibilities. And like Suzanne was explaining, really setting out where the risk owners and risk stewards sit and interact, and making that clear, to use her language. I think that invaluable, and that is the value that we really found from implementing that regulatory change model, is agreeing those roles and responsibilities and understand where the one starts and stops. But if we, and where we do that, we have a much clearer picture and less overlap and less inefficiencies. So that is a really key focus for us, to make sure that we've got those roles and responsibilities absolutely clear. I was wondering, Lee, is it okay to go to the second poll question?
So at which stage of regulatory change lifecycle do you experience the most regulatory pain? During horizon scanning, during implementation, or post-implementation? We've got 60% of people have voted. So let's just give it 30 seconds. Again, at which stage of regulatory change lifecycle do you experience the most regulatory pain? If you can please vote.
Clearly voted there.
I don't think I can, unfortunately. Again, I'll give it 10 more seconds. We've got nearly 80% of people have voted now. So, ooh, right, I've ended it. So I'm going to share those now. I'll download them as well for follow-up. Hopefully you'll be able to see those on your screen now. And Sonia, if you can you see them this time?
Yeah, I can see them this time, which is great.
Brilliant. So we've got 9% during horizon scanning, if I can say it, that's the side that already affected me, during implementation or post-implementation. And we've got 45% have said during and 45% have said post.
And that is, again, I pretty much like I expected, but I think perhaps even the post-implementation is slightly understated, but maybe from the kind of role I have, I really see that a lot. It is the embedding, it is the evidencing, the continuous maintenance. Suzanne was referring earlier to changes, new regulations that are slightly the same that you then need to amend processes for. I was expecting to see a little bit more on the last one, and that's where my vote was. It would be interesting to hear what others are thinking when we get to the fuller session. So we we found all stages tricky, to not to underestimate anything. Oh, now I can't close it. We found all stages tricky, and horizon scanning, it bites you in the backside if you're not careful, because it's quite easy for things to slip through. You may, how many jurisdictions can you contain all the time? There may be, clients sitting in a jurisdiction that you may not have a presence in, that may, there may be a regulation impacting them. So there's a lot of, and I know they are great tools, and I know they are great providers, but horizon scanning, not easy. And really to understand actually, how is it being executed? We have recently implemented or enhanced our process to have a much more triage approach. So again, greater collaboration and using different SMEs and combinations of SMEs to help with the horizon scanning interpretation that we get from the tools. So in terms of implementation, there's always a big bugbear, because that is where the focus is, the deadlines are. You can't really move, but you need to deliver BAU as well. And there's a lot of impact, certainly on, I think across the business. And then, as I said, post-implementation, I think is where we find a lot of need for your, what do you call it, self-demonstration? I would call it evidence.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Back to the over-engineered topic that I didn't explain at the start and confused loads of people. Yes, self-demonstration. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I referred to this connectivity quite a few times. I referred to, I mentioned how we implemented SOX at the same time as amending our operational risk taxonomy, and that really worked. I can see with the envisaged SOX-lite that, there will definitely be great benefits to be gained from, integrating with the risk and control environment and risk and control frameworks. I do personally, but this may just be because we're a US-owned firm, but I think there are many UK firms that have already implemented SOX. So from a financial services perspective, I don't think SOX-lite will be that intrusive, but it would be interesting to hear again what other market participants are saying. So yeah, that is basically, I think lastly, and I don't know how much time I've got left.
Oh no, I was just about to put the Boris COVID scale up. So we're at 5 minutes.
Oh, good planning. We're aligned. So lastly, I just wanted to reflect on the impact of SMCR and reg change. And, certainly from a UK perspective, and of course the regimes are being rolled out more broader in Emir, it has really brought home that senior manager conduct rule on, meeting the regulatory requirements and the ownership of that, and what that actually means to individual SMFs and which bits they own. So I think SMCR has really helped us and equipped us to drive the ownership, accountability, understanding who does what in this sphere significantly, and has really been a benefit, I would say, to the UK market and those other jurisdictions that is having it rolled out. But again, I would be interested to hear maybe in the panel discussions whether others have similar views or think differently.
No, absolutely, and obviously I could talk about SOX till the cows come home, and there's some at that window there actually on the way home now. But in terms of my experience at PwC when we were going through that period where everyone was doing the full SOX, end-to-end SOX, it was very laborious but very insightful. I learned a lot from my time being an external and internal auditor at that time. But with the SMCR piece as well coming in and accountability, it just feels like a natural fit to get the risks and controls aligned to processes and aligned to those underpinning IT systems to really get an understanding of where you are to meet those regulations. And I think that's really key with what Suzanne was chatting about as well, managing that continual change. And hopefully, well, I know we're going to be talking about this in Paul's chat in a second, around that combined assurance and that continual improvement as well. But I've had a couple of questions come in actually. And one of them is reflecting, this might be a plug for Women in Risk and Control though, which is fine. I don't usually allow that, but it's fine. But reflecting on the diverse panel, which would have been 3 if Bacola wasn't ill, and I hope she's getting well. We've heard from today. Do you think diversity has a role to play in implementing the regulatory change strategy?
And thank you for that plug. I really like that. And I would say absolutely, because what you do need, and it came through what Suzanne was saying, you do need a combination of people who know the business really well, who has got the deep experience of the business. You need some executors. Is that probably in the wrong?
It could be on that wheel there, which I've got there. That's my prop for Bacola's chat about behavioural change. But there is an executor on that one over there. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and then you need the wide variety of experience. And I was mentioning before, we use a triage approach to really look at our horizon scanning, what we could have missed, and we pick up some elements that somebody may have missed just from their viewpoint, where they were coming from. So and again, I think today the richness of having Paul on with his non-financial services focus, I think that just brings richness to the whole discussion and the implementation, effective implementation. So the short answer is yes, and you would have expected me to say that. So sorry for being so transparent.
No, that's absolutely perfect. And no, again, my thoughts go out to Bacola. She's not well today, but I was looking forward to having 3 key speakers, female leaders in the industry. And now you've got me and Paul ending at the end. So
it's all about balance, Lee.
Yeah, but I would say it's diversity of thought, right? So not diverse, not obvious diversity, obviously.
No, and one of the sections which I'll try and get into our conversation with me and Paul in a second. Joking aside, that's the TMS wheel, team management systems kind of approach, which I did a course on a few years ago and got accredited in it, but I've not really had a chance to use those magnets. So today I got the top of my barbecue out and they've got some magnets on the back and stuck them on there. And it's all about that behavioral change and the team dynamics and how you can really utilize those, independent of what sexuality it is. It's just, those different thought patterns and personas are really what needs to drive success within any kind of risk and compliance program. But I'll try and shoehorn a bit of that in a second. Well, I have got one more question for you, which is, you mentioned your years of experience across the lines of defence. So which practices do you think we should keep from the past, and what should we do differently going forward?
Well, I think the practices to keep is to keep the alignment. I think I have to add that my regulatory implementation experience is definitely not limited to SOX, right? It's an alphabet soup of like MAR and BCBS compliance and Basel and everything that you could throw at it. So but what I would like to lose, and what we have to lose, so Suzanne was talking about it, what we have to lose is slowness. We have to be so agile. We have to be able to risk failing and change, fail, and fall forward, right? We don't have the luxury anymore. I remember being a child and thinking it's so long between my birthday in May and Christmas. And nowadays, it just really goes in a blink of an eye. And the same is with reg change nowadays. We had years to prepare for SOX in days gone by. We had years to prepare for MAR. That luxury doesn't exist anymore. So it's that ability to really, really move faster and maybe not do it so perfectly first time.
Brilliant answer. Thank you very much. I will probably save a couple of the other questions for the panel session, if that's all right. And I know that Paul's been turning his camera off and on in order to get in there. That's not your fault. That's my fault, because I almost led into him and then pulled it back again. But no, thank you very much, Sonia. That was a fantastic 15 minutes, bang on actually. So our third speaker, who's kindly stepped in from his panel role to embody the third speaker role. And I'd like to clarify, just for Paul's sake, that when I did the actual comms or the landing page for the event, I wrote the title, because I did have one of our ex-colleagues, Rodney Andrews, call out the fact it said futurist. And I know that that wasn't something that you said. That was me that put that on there. And that was one of my props, was for me and you to look and radar scan into the future there as well. But no, I wrote that, not Paul. But he is an SME within the assurance industry, and I used to work with him at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's a real specialist in what he does. He is actually working for a public body at this minute in time, which I can't really mention. I think he can if he wants to, but he probably won't. But we want to
sound like a spy.
Well, that's a good way to sound, right?
It's not true though.
A futuristic digital spy. But in terms of what we'd like to speak about now, it was really to talk about the Bryden report that me and Paul caught up a couple of months ago actually, and Paul mentioned the Bryden report, and ever since it's been coming up in conversation since we had that chat. Really about specifically the title actually was born out of that conversation around the combined assurance and where we're going with the future of assurance, but also with the risk and compliance angle with the UK SOX-lite coming up. A lot of conversations and a lot of posts and webinars on LinkedIn at this minute in time. And then there's a few other areas. But I think if I welcome to the stage Paul, he's going to introduce our session on some general thoughts on how companies are combining their assurance practices. Is that a reasonable intro, Paul? Is that all right?
That's great. So thank you, Lee. So as a bit of background, never been involved in financial services, but I've done a lot across manufacturing, retail and utilities industry. So as Lee, I'm a chartered accountant, as Lee mentioned. I worked for quite a large number of years at PwC in external audit, internal audit, and also a lot of project review as well. More recently, I've worked in internal audit for a very large UK-based tobacco manufacturer that went through the whole SOX process sort of 3 or 4 years ago. So I've got quite a lot of relevant experience. I'll talk through as we go through an example. Now, in terms of the big thing that Lee mentioned at the moment, everyone's talking about the Bryden report. Now, the thing that drove Bryden was probably 3 or 4 years ago. You had a couple of more than a couple, but predominantly the failure of Carillion, but also British Home Stores. And a lot of the people were saying, where were the external auditors? And they're all turning around and say, well, we did what we were told to do, but the public were very rapidly losing faith in the audit process. That was recognised by one of the core governance bodies, so the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and they commissioned a guy called Donald Bryden to do a review. And it's actually quite a hard-hitting exercise. I mean, the thing that he said in his report that I think is quite appropriate, he talks about audit has lost its way and the actors in the process bear some of the responsibility. Now, he's very much focusing on the external auditors, but I think he was also talking to the internal audit function and also the compliance functions in these businesses as well. So as a result of that, Donald Bryden has come up with a paper that he probably issued getting on for 18 months ago, but because of COVID, the progress hasn't been that brilliant. But it does talk about this concept of UK SOX and directors taking more responsibility around the controls within a business. It's not quite finalised because it still be determined whether or not it's going to be like SOX in the US, whether you'll have a formal 302 attestation and a 404 by auditors. That still needs to be agreed. There's also, the broad and the breadth of the controls that are actually going to be part of the reporting, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about, we can come back to UK SOX, but there was a lot of other interesting things within what he recommended. And there's 5 things that I just wanted to call out. He was just talking about having a much more informative audit report other than just commenting on the numbers in the financial statements. So the first thing that he talks about is much better independent disclosure on risks. Are the companies in their report really calling out what the risks are to the organisation and whether or not they're properly calling out the mitigating controls and activities they're putting in place to manage that. That was the first thing. The second thing he's really picked up on is fraud, making it much more formalised again for companies to talk about the steps they're undertaking to detect and prevent fraud, and the auditors to actually comment whether or not those think are appropriate. The other thing, and this very much comes down to Carillion, signed off set of accounts and then the company goes broke 2 months later. Much better commentary around the resilience of an organisation, not just whether it's a going concern at the time that the auditors were signing, but actually whether it's got a future beyond, potentially up to 5 years in the future. And something that I thought was quite interesting, and we might have talked about like the third speaker has turned up, is for the external auditors to comment on the culture of the company. So if the directors are putting forward a view on we've got a great company, we're doing this, that. If the auditors don't believe that, to actually formally say that within their reporting. And then finally, and this is very much sort of a thing to my own heart, is he recognises and he wants to see better use of technology by the auditors, but also trying to encourage companies to actually share more of their data with the auditors, so the auditors can do much better analytics. And he believes that this will promote better quality audits. So everybody focuses on the Bryden report in the UK SOX, but there are other things in there. So it's quite a mixed bag. As I say, it's going through consultation at the moment, but it's highly likely a lot of the recommendations that he puts in there will come to fruition in some way, shape or form. So that's the sort of outline of the Bryden process. And I think that, yes, a lot of you large UK companies and probably in the financial sector already comply with SOX, but there's a lot of normal FTSE 100 companies and FTSE 350 that have to produce accounts, but their controlled environment's quite informal and they don't actually have to demonstrate to anyone outside the company.
Yep.
Maybe the auditors will take a slightly different approach, but they're actually monitoring their controls and testing them on a regular basis and basically keeping on top. So that's a quick summary of where Bryden's come from.
No, that's a great summary, and obviously it resonated in our conversation a few weeks ago with me, because that's what I was doing at PwC at the time, some of my time there, right? And you know, working with companies that didn't have a clue about their risks and their controls. They definitely didn't understand what IT systems underpinned key controls and mitigating controls, and you know, mapping out those processes and finding what was a control and what wasn't, which was also another issue, because they didn't know what a control was, right? So I know some of the, you know, the large tier one financial institutions will have adhered to the SEC, you know, Sarbanes-Oxley, but there's many that probably, you know, UK and Emir that probably haven't yet as well. You know, and I know from my time in the Big Four and in the last 7 years in the technology side, that many of them haven't got a real good grasp of their risk and control, or RACM or RCM, whatever you want to call it, across their business. You know, it's quite siloed, it's quite on spreadsheets, it's access database, it's IT department versus business department. And that was really where the wheel behind, let me get it, because it took me 10 minutes to put together, so bear with me. I don't know if you can see this on the camera. I'll try and put it so you can see it on the light, but this is the TMS wheel. It's very much like Myers-Briggs. And the team management systems approach is really trying to use the personas across teams to make sure that you communicate in the right way, you know, you understand your actions, and also communicate and deliver as well. Because if you're a controller producer against a creative innovator like myself, who's quite strategic, and you're an analyst in this area that likes the detail, you're going to get a clash. And there's a link this there, which I forgot to put in, is how do you make that link? How do you communicate that across that divide? And that's something I'm really passionate about. And that's what, you know, Vicola was going to talk about behavioral change, because she's just set up the career masterclass, but she was ex-Barclays frontline as well. And that's what I've been chatting to her about, because, you know, this is kind of my passion. But that's to your cultural shift piece, Paul, around, you know, getting people educated on what they're doing, but not only that, educate them on what areas they are in here. Because near enough everyone probably on the call and in reasonably sized businesses has done something like this. We did something at ASIN 2 weeks ago around the Myers-Briggs, but no one ever utilizes that data, and definitely doesn't utilize it to enhance delivery of compliance and, you know, first and second line. And it's something I think they should do. And there's various ways they could tie that to technology as well. But I'll put this back because it's quite heavy, because it's my barbecue lid. So bear with me. Well, is that in line with what you were thinking, Paul?
Yeah, no, definitely. I suppose another thing, we sort of move on to sort of the concept of looking across the combined assurance spectrum.
Yep.
So a lot of things that you find is a lot of the UK corporates, when they first put in SOX, they thought, well, we'll just get it in and then we'll look at how we can make it more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of them are finding actually their cost of SOX and other compliance functions is actually quite a considerable sum of money. And also they're getting last minute problems in terms of, you know, control breaks down. So it's not only from a SOX point of view, but just generally when they're doing the audit. So a lot of them are starting to look about how they can combine their assurance functions, first, second, and third line defense, and make sure that they're actually recognizing the work that they do and maybe not over auditing particular areas. And one of the things that's really come to the fore is the use of technology around this. you know, through different facets. So, I mean, I don't know whether touching on what other people have said. So one of the things I was looking at whilst I was my previous employer, a large tobacco company, is I led the implementation of the automation of our risk management system. So we put in a product from SAP to help the different functions understand and document their risks and make them visible, so legal could see what the research and development guys were doing, etc., etc. But the things we were starting to look at was also is how we could look at the underlying work of the compliance function and how that mapped through to the risks. And this whole thing around technology gives a lot of positives. You can do a proper top-down assessment, you know, at an audit committee that says these are our key corporate risks. Actually, yes, we have mitigating controls in place that help us reduce the residual risk, but who's actually testing those controls? Who's actually making sure they're working effectively? You get a much better visibility of all of the controls work that's done across the compliance function, whether that's truly helping the business address its key corporate risks. You know, but it also helps different departments understand and how, you know, legal might be managing a particular sanctions risk, but it also might help manufacturing to understand what legal are doing and how they can actually contribute to that process in terms of the controls that they're testing. And then the other thing is, because you have these sort of risk and controls ecosystems that are underpinned by technology, because it's more dynamic and real time because you're doing continuous testing.
Yep.
Also helps you identify on a much quicker basis whether or not you've got a particular control breakdown, and people can address that. Similarly, if a new risk comes up, so, you know, everybody talks about COVID, and everybody would have said a year or so ago, oh yeah, we've got the pandemic in, you know, we've recognized that in risk, but no one really recognized, they said it would be a pandemic, but it would be in a particular region because it only happened in the past in the Middle East or, you know, in Asia. People got caught out the fact that it was actually a global thing. But if you have these systems, you're able to respond to risks so much quicker, you know, things that come up unexpected. And then the other thing that I just want to talk to is what I'm quite passionate about is, to be honest with you, if you're doing an external audit or an internal audit, or you're doing a plant, you're doing loads of detailed testing, it can actually be quite boring. If you can use the technology,
I can attest to that.
if you can use the technology to take that drudgery, you could use robots or things like that to do some of the testing for you and provide you with the information. People in the compliance function tend to be more motivated, but they have more, they're keener on what they're doing, but it also allows them to look across the data to look better for trends and things like that. So they can actually start to see maybe this sort of forward looking to see whether or not a trend where controls are starting to break down in the region. So technology can also not only improve your staff morale, but it frees up time for the staff to actually identify where potential risks could become issues in, you know, in the near future. So it's a bit around that. So I know we were talking about the combined thing, but I also wanted to sort of give a view around how technology could help with this whole combined assurance ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And, you know, and this is a peer thought leadership. It's not a sales engine. Yeah. So, you know, I'm not going to talk from where I sit now at ACIN, but there's also that community intelligent aspect as well, in terms of, you know, the testing aspect that you mentioned within a global firm, but there's also across firms within financial services, within, you know, non-financial services, and how there's a shift there with technology, with our futurist kind of, you know, looking at the horizon side of things for the new technology coming forward. You've got your fintechs, your regtechs, your subtechs, the supervisory techs, the new one, right? Subtech, and all those coming as well. So combining all those to, you know, project internally and making sure that those connections work is something that's quite key. But one question's come in, which is, you know, what is the expected impact from the Bryden report on the scope of auditors? You might have touched on this already, and UK listed companies. You know, whilst the concept is, you know, about the reporting requirement, you know, what other aspects is there?
So I think, I mean, it's a really good question, actually. So I think external auditors today would just say, well, we just look at the annual report and the financial statement. And I think what Bryden said, no, corporates nowadays are pushing out a lot more information, you know, how they're dealing with climate change, you know, environmental, social, you know, how they're looking after their.
Well, it's funny you should mention climate change and ESG, because we have someone on the panel that might be able to explain a bit more about that. So that's good.
So I think what Donald Bryden was saying was, yes, but you guys need to do a lot more. You actually need to independently validate some of this information these companies are putting out there. So, you know, I've touched on the different principles around fraud, et cetera, but But I suppose the essence is to give a much more comprehensive coverage, the external audit give a much more comprehensive coverage of the information that the company's putting out there, rather than just the historical financial statements. A bit more look into the future when companies are talking about what they're doing around climate change, their workers and things like that, to actually validate that what they're saying is truly correct, or how they're going to manage future risks and things like that. So
yeah, no, that's really good point. And another area which I was going to draw into Bakola's conversation around behavioural change again, was about the rise in senior risk professionals on LinkedIn. And I presume most people on this call are LinkedIn because they probably saw my incessant posting about this event on there. But in terms of these senior professionals at tier 1 banks, financial services and beyond, are posting a lot on LinkedIn about their connections or meetings on regulations or with associations. I'm seeing more and more of that on LinkedIn, which I think to this self-demonstration piece, and the social media aspect of proving they're doing that. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on regulation in general, stuff that's probably not so much impacted on financial services, but others. So just a couple of examples. So we've talked about GDPR, that's been in for 3 years, but things like the EU directive around single-use plastics, trying to get rid of people buying a water bottle, you drink the water, you just chuck the bottle away. They're trying to reduce that, or you'd seen that with 10p now for a shopping bag, whereas previously you would have got them for free. So that's driven that, and companies are having to respond to that because they're have to start recycling stuff that comes in, secondly. And then there's other things, and we'll probably talk about that. So for instance, there's a new bit of regulation that's coming in for 2023 and 2025, the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. So companies are going to have to say how they're managing the risk of all of this climate change legislation coming in. I know Joe Biden has been talking about coming in with a whole new swathe of regulation as part of his legacy as a president around climate change and the use of plastics and emissions and things like that. So there's a lot of challenges to companies, again, about how they recognise and respond to the risk that they're not doing what they want. And maybe one of the things we'll talk about, so it's not just governments now that judge companies on how they're doing responding to climate change or use. But one of the things we can talk about is consumerism. There's a lot of things on social media now where companies are marked down quite actively by probably younger generations if they're seen to be environmentally bad or things like that. And people tend to shy away from buying their products and things like that. So the whole thing around the consumer and climate change, there's a whole lots of different risks coming in that these companies need to respond to. That isn't just about regulation, it's also about society's expectations as well, which sometimes preempt particular legislation, regulation.
No, absolutely. And I think someone mentioned on the call the other day about the tipping point or the wobble point. I like the term wobble point, actually. We've hit zero bang on, actually, which is perfect timing. So no, thank you very much, Paul, for that, and stepping in at the last minute to take the final spot for us. Okay. So a big thank you to all 3 speakers. They've given up time prior to the event, like I mentioned as well. We did a few sessions to make sure that the talks dovetailed in quite nicely, and then led to the panel session as well. So this is the final session when I wanted to bring in, it would have been 3, it's actually 2 special guest stars onto the panel to join the esteemed group of speakers. We have Ian Ewart, who is, ASIN. He was one of the founders at ASIN and now leads the climate risk and ESG side of ASIN. We've also got Drew Paul, from CAPCO, who leads the regulatory change and reg tech side of CAPCO. So we're going to ask a couple of questions to those 2 first, and then we'll open it out to the wider panel, if that's all right, to really feed off what was said before, and also just bounce off some of the questions that we've asked now, and hopefully it is going to come through as we go through this as well. So one of the questions I had for Ian, really, first of all, it was Paul, but he's not there anymore, was have we reached the tipping point regarding ESG? And it could have been you that mentioned the wobble point, actually, the other day. Is society ready to hold companies accountable and drive that change, that cultural shift?
So, Paul made a number and several of reinforcing really important points that I think kind of reflect really what's been happening in society. So there are moments when corporate culture catches up with society, certain corporate set trends, societal trends just emerge. And I think this has been one of these kind of moments where we knew there was something brewing. We felt very uncomfortable. And I think as the sort of levels of discomfort arise, and, you know, people working in the city of London, people working in New York, and same would have been true in Switzerland or HK or wherever. Going to work in financial services, you had to walk past the climate activists that were supposedly disrupting our lives. But actually, I think people were kind of slowing down as they were walking past those demonstrations and thinking, oh, yeah, you know, there's something here which leaves me decidedly uncomfortable. And I think there was a bit of a societal moment there. And of course, you know, we were getting increasingly uncomfortable about that. And then we got blindsided and hit by COVID. And everybody was confined and everybody had to be at home. And then there's a whole series of themes, and Paul has already enumerated a number of them. And, you know, from plastic bags through to people thinking creatively around better solutions and a better way of living, and then the sort of polar bears and ice caps bit being done by the beloved David Attenborough, sort of sets a whole tone. And then actually we sort of come together, and I don't know how human beings do this, but we're pretty good at doing these things, and we realize that we need to actually legislate and set some boundaries and set some rules for ourselves, and we're in the process of that right now. The regulation is coming. You know, COP26 is about that. And what are we doing? Well, we're basically putting together a whole series of societal tendencies, things which companies have been getting towards, and we're basically putting that together and distilling it. And as ever, you know, what gets measured gets done. You know, back to the points that Sonia was making in terms of how regulations get implemented and so on. You know, back to your looking glasses and looking through the binoculars going forward for this.
Get my
you know,
prop out again.
Yeah, get the prop out again. Yeah, we do learn from the past, but we tend to need to go through this process each time. And I think that, you know, a little bit like your Wheel of Fortune with the Wheel of Personalities there, and, you know, how do we make this happen? It needs care and attention. And I think this is one opportunity where we're actually really collectively giving ourselves the best chance to succeed.
That's a great overview. Thank you very much. And we'll probably come back onto that in a second,
Yeah.
as we link everything up, actually. But again, I wanted to just introduce Drew. I may have got your title wrong, Drew, so I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
You promoted me. That's perfectly fine.
Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that's good. At least
It's always good.
But we mentioned that we talked the other day as well, and I just wanted to, you know, introduce a quick question or two to yourself around how can you prove, you know, what you've done around regulations, you know, and how can you meet the new requirements to an acceptable level? Because me and you were talking about, you know, you're not going to meet every regulation perfectly, right? I'm a recovering perfectionist. You know, I've made that step at least away from being a perfectionist. I'm a recovering perfectionist now. But in terms of, you know, achieving what's needed or the baseline of those regulations, how do you prove that you're doing that, or how do you know that you're getting that baseline and achieving some success?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, from my kind of experience of this, I think it's exactly that. It's organizations have historically, you know, if you look back when sort of the reg landscape pretty much started with kind of Dodd-Frank, and I'm talking reg reporting here, it was very, you know, it's quite, it was very prescriptive. It was, you know, a lot of black boxes. And what we've seen since then is that regulations gotten more complex, yet the systems and people and systems and processes that work in that space have continued to sort of maintain the status quo. And I think what we're seeing more and more is as organizations evolve and they sort of get a lot more, I guess they start to get a bit more sophisticated, what we're starting to see more, what I'm starting to see more and more is that there is, you know, people are sort of realizing that it's the burden of proof is probably the hardest part of regulation. And the way that we're seeing a lot of sort of sophisticated organizations meet this is through the sort of use of emerging regulatory technology, pretty much, right? Because what you have is you have the ability to sort of, if you cover off the sort of horizon scanning piece, which Sonia sort of touched on, you have the ability to, you know, use tools to tell you what regulations coming down the pipe and what impact it has to your organization. As you go further down the stack, you have tools that enable you to basically assess how you're responding to a regulation, to what that tool would do to sort of make your assurance processes more effective. So I think it's kind of about, you know, turning up the dial on the kind of technology use, and more importantly, and I think this is where a lot of these organizations that we speak to on a weekly, monthly basis are taking their lead, is they're quickly realizing the regulators now have access to the same technology. So the regulator starts to spot that, you know, there's issues with what you're doing before you spot it. That to them is a real concern. So I think it's a case of, you know, as regulators start to use more technology and or supervisory technology, firms need to step up the game. And we're seeing that the sell side's definitely doing it, but more importantly, weirdly, you know, a sector which has generally been quite, I'd say, lackluster in their efforts to be compliant, the buy side is quickly starting to pick up. So, you know, you are seeing this across the board where, you know, firms are basically turning to technology, realizing that, you know, investing in their own systems hasn't really paid off. And you still, you know, we've got organizations that spend 100 to, you know, 250 to like $1 billion, pounds, Swiss francs, whatever currency it is, to meet where they are today on a reg landscape. And if you look at the quality of the reporting, it doesn't justify that level of spend. So I think it's that. And then there is a combination of sort of, you know, change fatigue is starting to set in, right? I don't know, Son, you've probably implemented them all, but there's probably we're on sort of 12 to 13 sort of large regulation now coming around the corner. And you're sat there going, people are tired of this, right? Front offices don't want to give you any more money to do this. They're questioning why you continue to spend, why the quality of data is still poor, why, you know, you're still getting hit with fines when you shouldn't be. So I think it's a case of, it's not, you know, going down that route you've always taken isn't going to work anymore. And I think organizations are quickly starting to realize that is the case, and you got to find better ways to do it. I'm not saying RegTech is the only way to do it, but it's one of the ones that has proven to be successful.
That's a really good point. And, you know, most people on the call that know me or have been to the sessions before know that the last 7 years I've spent in the risk tech, GRC, IRM, whatever you want to call it, EGRC. And, you know, there's a load of rip and replace that happens every 3 or 4 years within that cycle of software. And the main reason for that, I believe, is the data, to your point, Drew, around, you know, quality of data that feeds those systems. The systems pretty much do all the same things with a few nuances that may or may not meet your bespoke kind of ways of doing things in your FS and non-FS kind of industry. But it's ultimately the lack of data or the lack of investment in getting the right risk and control data. That actually means that it's replaced every 4 years. So as the technology improves and, you know, the community kind of aspect comes in, to your point about the regulators dipping in as well, that doesn't have to be a negative approach. It could actually be welcome to say, we'll give you some desensitized information across the board. You dip in and see how your regulations are improving the foundations within the financial services industry, be it whatever, you know, sector of that. You've got, you know, investment banking, you've got retail, insurance, corporate finance, the rest of them, right? And then outside of NF as well. If they can dip in and see that information and see it's improving over time, they'll have more comfort that, you know, their regulations are actually doing something. At the minute, I don't think they get that, and they just go around hitting people with sticks, which is, I think, right?
I mean, I think, you know, your points around, you know, the only thing that's really different is the data is very true. So there's no competitive advantage in building your own reg engines and reporting engines. The same way, you know, the regulators are also, they're becoming more sophisticated in terms of using supervisory technology, but they're also realizing, I mean, you know, I sit on a couple of Bank of England panels where they started quickly realizing that, you know, you can't have this state where you have sort of non-machine readable regulation. So we're quickly starting to see regulators head in that direction. So it's only a matter of time before, you know, if you wait until the regulator moves to that point, then you're again behind the curve. So it's sort of, you may as well kind of get up to speed, realize there is zero competitive advantage in reg reporting, or actually compliance generally. Apart from, of course, if you get it wrong, then there's definitely disadvantages, and sort of get on that train before, you know, everybody jumps on and, you know, basically don't wait until everybody else is on it, which a lot of firms like to do today.
No, that is a really good point. And at that point, I'll probably open it out to, to Sonia, to Suzanne, and to Paul. But in terms of, one of the questions that came in was about what can you use that you've already done? So, I've always talked about test once, comply many. That's always been really difficult to do because no one knows what controls hit what regs and what's part of that regs, or if there's two controls doing the same thing across one reg, all those kind of approaches. So I don't know who wants to answer that one, but how do you see that we can leverage some things that are already done? Is that one maybe for Sonia, do you think, or Suzanne?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off, and Suzanne, you obviously have got rich experience in this. Certainly what I've seen over a number of organizations, including BNY Mellon, is that we do traceability, we do reg mapping, absolutely making sure that it's one to many, right? So you can't, there's no luxury. I mean, I mentioned the pace of change. I mentioned the pressure on implementation and sustaining and evidencing it. I don't know how you do it without the enabling tools, actually.
Brilliant.
Exactly, Sonia. We've really tried to focus on, I think I mentioned the sort of buy versus build debate. And as Drew said, there are tools in the market that are far more sophisticated than anything we could build internally, not because we're not capable, but because that AI is really valuable. And if a firm has perfected it, then it makes a lot more sense for us to buy it in and apply it to our architecture than to try to replicate it. And it also provides a little bit of air cover because there are certain tools that the regulators have become quite familiar with. So if we say we're using them, it gives us a little bit of additional credence. Again, we might not always get it right, but we're trying hard, and we're trying to really adapt and be nimble and utilize what's out there to get the best results. So.
No, I think that's a great point. And, I've seen it I've been involved in Section 166 reviews from a technology perspective in my old role, and also from a consultancy perspective as well. And just seeing the proactiveness, Suzanne, to your point, but if you've got a Section 166 as well, that usually says to use some technology to automate some part of the processes if it's an antiquated business. But if you're providing proactive incentive to, or not incentive, it's the wrong word, but you're being seen to being proactive by the regulators, that can only be a good thing.
I agree. Yeah, because again, like, we're not always going to get it right, but you do you don't get points for trying. It's not third grade baseball. Sorry, that's an American reference, but but there is a sort of, particularly if you read through some of the enforcement actions the FCA has issued and the CFTC as well. There is mitigating credit given for efforts made to comply, and a recognition in the event that you do somehow end up in a proper enforcement action. Their penalty model is even contingent on credit for having proper processes in place, and if you still manage to have an issue, they recognize that is mitigated, or what's the word I'm looking for, ameliorated by the effort to comply and by trying to engage in continuous improvement to do it better each time. So we take some comfort in that, but ultimately.
No, but I like the analogy, the baseball analogy. It's a global supper club, you see, although it's a lunch club in the States,
right, on
the East Coast at the minute. Yeah. But in terms of, you don't want to get to the stage where you're being hit with a Section 166 or any kind of it's a situation like that. But the transitioning away from that consultancy or that chosen one, because there's a list of people that can do it, isn't there? To transition away usually involves leaving behind some kind of technology or some kind of automation, some kind of improvement in the processes and risk and controls, which is really good. And I've just seen actually a really good question come in that Drew, I think, have you taken this question? Are you there, Drew?
I didn't expect to take the question, but I can answer.
Oh no, it just says
Drew would like to answer this question.
I know.
So
I pressed it. Well, anyway. So I do have a view, though. I mean,
you want me to state what it is first, because it's a long one. I'll try and do it quickly. It's from Mark Leopold, who I know really well. He's based in Holland, actually, Netherlands. Sorry. So societal developments / expectations are indeed likely to drive regulation. Regulation, however, is still merely an external driver for companies. it could be argued that regulations are relevant to create a level playing field, but fall short of making material changes in ESG and other areas. That is likely to only come from an internal drive, i.e. compliance versus self-motivation. Has the panel any thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts. Do you want me to start? And then you can,
yeah, of course, go for it. Go for it, Sonia.
The focus that the FCA in recent years have had on a purpose and how that actually underpins culture, value, behaviors, and outcomes. I think that is the right approach, and that is sort of in line with what this question was, right? And I agree. If you get the underlying purpose right and people do the right thing, it's much more effective than having all these, millions and millions of rules to try and implement stuff. But that's just, we have been going on a journey, and I think many others in the financial services industry. I participate in many of the industry bodies that's really been focusing on how do we do the underlying, how do we make, and that purpose is not just the purpose to, for your shareholders, it is your purpose for in society as well. And how do you actually link that an organization can really see its values go with a purpose, and that drives the behaviors that you work with. Sorry, I stole your thunder there, Drew.
No, that's fine. I mean, I was going to sort of answer that internal versus external driver sort of component in the question. So my view on this is that, so I agree the regulation sort of tries to get firms to a level playing field. But I think if you gave an organization the option to, be compliant, right? I think there'd be very few out there that chose to go down that route. So I think actually the majority of sort of drivers are external. So, if you look at recent examples, it's sort of reputational damage by, for whatever reason, any sort of regulatory failing has massive implications for any organization. And that generally comes from the kind of people that, I'll sort of make up the bulk clients within these organizations, especially when you look at kind of global markets. And then the second thing, which I read, I'm going to say last week, maybe earlier this week, was, you now have firms like Berkshire Hathaway being asked by their shareholders as to what the hell they're doing for ESG. So clearly there is a drive from sort of large shareholders within these organizations to get these firms to actually, step up and take some responsibility for, the impact they have when you look at things like ESG. So I think I do think, internally, yes, there's always that sort of, if I don't comply, I will get fined, and that has an impact on my balance sheet. But I think more and more we're starting to see that the external kind of, the external drivers of reputational damage, your shareholders, your investors, etc., asking you to get on board these, get on board with these initiatives is probably driving it more than you would have expected. I mean, I think as Lee said, I work for Capco. Like for us as a firm, we're clearly seeing a lot of demand in the ESG space, and that's being driven because people don't have a clue about how to achieve it. They clearly realize that their participants or their clients are asking for this, and they clearly realize that failure to do so and failure to do so in time is going to basically result in a reduction in sort of throughput and flow for these organizations. So I think it's weirdly, it is, internally, if you don't comply, you'll get fined, but externally, if you don't comply, the chances are you won't be around to, suffer the internal consequence in the long run.
No, that's a fantastic answer, and it might be something I don't know if Ian, Paul, or Suzanne want to add your angle to as well. From my side personally, I'm going back to the SMCR piece and the responsibility and more people accountable, sticking their arms up or hands up even, and being accountable. That's something I've seen in my time, both technology and consultancy side, is the lack of responsibility, either being dished to people or people actually hiding behind controls and not taking responsibility for them. So that SMCR piece is an internal compliance issue, but I haven't seen that much self-motivation is what I'm trying to say. I've seen the opposite.
I think it's interestingly, that the question comes from the Netherlands, where bankers make an oath, in terms of their conduct. And to Sonia's point, I think this creating the right culture with the right controls that engenders the right conduct is really important. And I agree with Drew, but I think that people have got really good now at working out whether companies are authentic in terms of whether they're actually living what they're doing or whether they're just getting away with it. And I think increasingly that will be where the distinction will be. Are you just getting away with it, or are you really living it?
Yeah, and to that point, actually, you know, I'm glad Mark's accepted and registered, because he's good for his questions. But he was saying, does reputational damage really impact that much? Obviously, you've got the Credit Suisse scandal at the minute. You've got Westpac. You've got obviously Archipelago. I could never pronounce that. Scandal as well.
Well, I think interesting.
Really suffer, do you think?
Yeah, I think interesting. Sorry to speak over you, Lee.
Oh, that's right. No.
But interestingly, Paul, you mentioned that background in the tobacco industry. Well, there's an industry whose reputation had to be managed and is still being managed, and had all kinds, what could be, what could be finance's cigarette moment, or you might argue we've already had that, and we've had it a few times, Yeah.
I mean, sorry, just to add, talking about the ESG, so, for non-financial companies, particularly manufacturing companies, they're marketing directly to the consumers. So they now talk about the consumer, and society is more important than their shareholders, because they can see if they're not doing the right thing. And BAT is very tuned into this as well, because it's known. I mean, when I was at school, and that was a long time ago, you smoked, it was bad for you. So no one could claim otherwise.
At school in the class.
That's right. So people always know, so they've always managed their reputation and all of the legal cases, but they're very, with a new product. So you've got the old cigarettes and cigars, but even with the new product, so these things are supposed to be reduced, harm devices. So either, the vaping where you get the nicotine's dissolved in a fluid in your inhalers, the steam, things like that, or where they heat the tobacco but you don't burn it. So they thought they were going great guns. And then you had Juul in the US, was a quick startup, was worth a huge sum of money in a very short time. And then all of a sudden you had these kids in America dying because certain American manufacturers were putting too much nicotine in the product compared to the others. And these teenagers, because it was coming out with flavors like, not tobacco flavor, it's watermelon.
Cherry. I have to buy it for my other half down the local shop.
so these, and they've got, there's like one of those little, to give you a perspective, one of those little vials that you have that you use for your vaping tool has as much nicotine as a packet of cigarettes, and these kids were having 3 or 4 of these every day, and they were suffering nicotine poisoning. So all of a sudden you've got that coming in, and all of a sudden the new products from the tobacco companies were deemed to be very bad, and the government were focusing on, and they were talking about tax. So coming from that side, there's always a constant review of social media, about what are the consumers saying about the product, and the way that BAT itself would respond to that quite quickly is quite telling. So they're more interested in appeasing society and the consumers than necessarily the shareholders, because ultimately, if you don't address how society views you correctly, your profits are going to tumble anyway, and the shareholders are going to be pissed off as well. So I think.
Beep. Sorry, I missed the beeping out of that.
Yes. So I was just going to say, I think outside of FS, companies are even more aware of the ESG agenda, but very much around society's expectations, more and more every single day than traditionally would have been.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting, just to build on that. And we've got a few minutes left now, but in terms of, I think Mark's point might be that in manufacturing, that tends to impact, that's why they probably focus on the customers as well. But are we seeing the same in, like the Credit Suisses and the Westpacs, or, the loads that have happened before? Are they really seeing any impact in their customer base, or, are the customer base educated enough to start picking up on this? I think ESG, yes, Ian, I would have think so. They're starting to be. But with the financial stories that have happened before, most people probably don't read them, and they just can't be bothered moving banks and all that kind of aspects as well. Do you think that's changing to the panel?
I think it's very significant, the change that's being committed to, because it's actually at a supranational level. Decisions have been made to say we can affect change most effectively through the financial services sector. So by the way in which you deploy your balance sheets, where money gets lent how money gets managed, you know, and that's really where the UN, and there's a lot of collective thought gone behind this. This is not a you know, a 5-minute exercise. Has basically said that is where we will drive change most effectively, by deciding where economic resources get allocated going forward.
But we are not selling that and the response to that as a regulatory impetus. We're selling it as an organizational impetus. We want to do that.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant by internal versus external.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
and I completely agree with that, Sonia. I think it, you know, the test will be just how authentic it is, you know, because people will see through it. So there's a lot of conversation at the moment around greenwashing. There's a lot of people about conversation around, you know, are the base calculations really, you know, the cost of the carbon set off, is that really detailed enough, and so on. I think at one level there's going to be huge amounts of debate around that, and no doubt there'll be fortunes made and lost and so on. But the great thing is it's center stage, it's front and center right now. It's being talked about, and there isn't a firm out there which isn't thinking about how it does good as opposed to doing harm. And the first part of the change that was required was really to say, we're in a hole, let's stop digging. And then the next part is, well, tell us what measures you can take to start improving that. And the third part is show us how you're going to measure those changes. You know, that's really what the regulation is going to boil down to. And I almost look at that and I think, well, we've been here before, haven't we? You know, those are you know, sort of classic regulatory frameworks. You know, where are we now? What are you doing? What are you going to do differently, and how are you going to measure it? You know, a lot of it comes
with operational resilience. I was just speaking over you to get back at you. But no, apologies for speaking over you. But no, you know, with operational resilience and SMCR and the GDPR a few years ago, all that kind of stuff, right? And the others coming down the line. And we've got a minute to 7, so we can wrap it up now. I think 2 questions that have come in, which I might have missed actually, but I'll collate any other questions that have come in to like a follow-up bit of content and post that on the website. And I didn't mention at the start, but it is Chatterman's rule. But I'm hoping that at the end of this, because I'll speak to all the speakers, everyone that spoke, and Mark. I don't usually include any of the questions, and I'll edit it down, and it'll be sent around the speakers to make sure they're okay with it before we're able to maybe pop it onto the website and make it accessible for anyone that couldn't make it due to competing diaries, etc. But is there anything that we didn't speak about that we'd like to mention before we wrap up? Suzanne, is there any closing comments? I'll go around actually, if that's all right.
Yeah, the thing I've been most struck by is it's really interesting to think about the stuff we think about every day, but in a different context. So, you know, the issues that financial services faces from an ops risk and compliance perspective are sometimes quite unique, but really at base they're no different than manufacturing, or which is sort of figuring out the best way to get it right in a tight cost environment with lots of resource pressure. So I found this really useful. Thank you.
No, thank you for joining. And Sonia, any closing comments or summaries?
For me, the takeaway again is just the value of the connections we made. You know, we get the value from understanding which regs are similar. We get the value from understanding how do we connect with different people in a different organization to deliver. And you know, so this was and I actually think your tree works with the roots. I just wanted to tell you your.
Oh, thank you. You're the first one to mention that. No one commented on my Buddhist kind of approach to as above, so below. So thank you for that. What about Drew's on mute? So I'll go to Ian for a closing comment.
Yeah, I would just reiterate. I think the sort of usefulness of the framework that we have, which you know is almost second nature, and can sometimes be seen as a little bit of an imposition. I think, you know, to Suzanne's point, we can make a real virtue of the fact that we're actually good at doing this stuff, and you know, it can be a source for collaboration, because there'll be lots of recognition points as well between firms and across firms, and you know, that this is, I think, something we can rejoice in.
I think, and that's a good word to use actually, because, you know, risk and compliance, or, you know, operational risk, you know, it's never been that, you know, kind of a sexy kind of terminology, or, you know, it's not been looked at positively within firms, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
even to Paul's point around, you know, internal audit, external audit, it's always been seen with a negative connotation. And I think that's always needed to change, and it's starting to change now, because more education, I think, is happening internally. Back to my wheel that's down there, which I'll send a picture, I'll put it on the website. But thanks, Ian. And then Paul, is there any summary points or final comments from yourself?
No, I must admit, I thought it was a really good session, actually. I've learned a lot around financial services coming from a low base. And I did feel it put a lot more sort of apples on your tree of life, so to speak.
Oh, I like that. Thank you for that.
Even more cider for you in the future.
Well, apple the cider, I didn't even make that connection. I was going to say the next batch in October, if anyone wants one, ping me and I'll send one in the post. It's not too bad. It's got, you know, I've got the bubbles in it, so it's all right. But no, that's a good one. You know, the strength of the roots shows how far you grow, or something like that. I came up with the other week, but we'll move on quickly. Drew, final comments. Thank you, Paul. Drew, any final comments?
No, to be honest, nothing over what's already been said. I think it was a really good session and good to hear from, I guess, all the panelists and speakers, and to see sort of how it, to be honest, how it's all sort of interconnected, irrespective of financial services or not. It's all got the same kind of challenges.
A bit like roots of a tree, right? Like
just exactly like that, Lee. Surprising.
But no, I want to just summarize now, because I know we've gone a few minutes over it, just to thank all of you for, you know, sparing your precious time to attend, the people that are registered and attended, but also the speakers as well, who, again, I'll mention, gave up some time this week and last week to align on calls to make sure that, you know, the topic made sense, to Joan's point when she questioned me at the start. So that's fine. I hope you enjoyed the conversations. Like I mentioned, there will be an edited, the smaller version that will be green lighted by everyone, and we'll make it available in a week or so. And if you did like it, please tell everybody, your family, anyone you can. If you didn't, just please keep it quiet and don't tell anyone. But we'll hopefully see you at live events. This is hopefully the final virtual session. We may do some in between live events, but I really want to get back to the magic of the live events in London. Hopefully do a follow-up in Edinburgh, because we had a really good session in Edinburgh in October 2019. I'd love to start one in Manchester and then Dublin, and then we're going to, you know, go global. So hopefully you'll all stay involved and pass the word on. So thank you all. Have a great evening, and speak to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
A big thank you to our co-sponsors for tonight's event. That's ACIN and Capco. Also, a big thank you to the Women in Risk and Control, who this is in association with, and the RegTech Forum, for helping us with speakers and for content for this session as well.